is that I could not be here yesterday. I was in the southern part of Malawi, the hub of Cyclone Freddy. So you would understand that I needed to be there. But at least today I'm here to interact. At least I'll have a chance to interact with a few of you. So my name is Sophie Kaunungira, board chair for Seasoning. Thank you.
Thank you, our board chairs. Anyone new from this desk? All right. Anyone new? Oh, anyone new on that desk? Zambia desk. Is there anyone new? Anyone new on this desk? Excuse me. Okay. Anyone here? There? Anyone new? Anyone who has not introduced themselves for the last 2 days? There? Kadecom. Anyone new on that desk? Okay, anyone who feels like is new. Okay, so I think it's only 2 people who are new in this space. We welcome the people that have joined us today, and some of you joined us yesterday, so welcome. We've had 2 days of a marathon of discussions around the issue of loss and damage. I think you'll be getting updates, but you also see the work that we are going to be presenting today, which actually the humble participants here contributed a lot, and with some of the people who were online. I want to start with this program by calling in front my brother Philip, who is supposed to take us through a recap for today, just to tell us what we've been able to discuss yesterday. After that, we'll go into the other sessions of discussing what the communique looks like before we go into the formalities of closing this symposium. I hope we've been charged throughout. We know what loss and damage is. We know what are the areas that we need to work with, and so on and so forth. And I think one quick announcement, I think there's also going to be another program extending in the afternoon. I hope those that were Philip and Charles were able to discuss with some of you who are supposed to remain. And I also want to call upon my colleagues from the CISONEC membership that you were also requested yesterday to remain for the afternoon session. So I think we'll have, if you have any questions about that, you can find me. Thank you. Philip, over to you.
Thank you, Julius. Good morning, dear delegates. Good morning, comrades. I'll request that we stand, please. We've been here for the last 2 days. We've been here for the last 2 days. Some of you have not even smiled. It's like we're in the negotiation room. It's not, it's a good discussion. Turn to the person to your left, greet them, tell them good morning in your local language. Turn to the person on your right, greet them in your local language, tell them good morning. Turn to anyone you haven't talked to, go tell them good morning. Okay, you may have your seats. Thank you. Please have your seats. Yeah, please have your seats so that we can begin. Thank you. Yeah, I know we are fighting for climate justice, but it's never that serious, in this room. So it's good to appreciate each other. My name is Philip Dinga. I work with PACJA. So I'd like to take you through the recap for yesterday. And as I do that, I'd like to call upon some of the colleagues who are leading or chairing the sessions. So I'll request them to step to the front so that they can give us high-level highlights on our discussions for yesterday. So if you can hear me, okay, let's just take a moment to finish with this interesting arrangement. Okay, thank you. Now that we're settled, good morning once more. Yes, I think we have the energy for the day. It's going to be a fairly short session. I'd request my brother Philip from PACJA to step to the front, take one of these seats. Nicholas, are you in the room? Nicholas? Where is Nicholas? He's gone out. Nicholas, welcome back. Philip Kilonzo, please step to the front. Nicholas Abuya, please occupy one of these seats. I'll tell you the assignment that you have. Teresa, is she around? Okay, right. So the reason I'm calling on those gentlemen is because I'd like them to give us high-level summary of what we discussed. But our discussion through yesterday started with the high-level technical session that discussed concretizing Pan-African influence in framing loss and damage, institutional and financial mechanisms that are critical and should be defining the character of African submissions on the roadmap to the Transitional Committee. And this was done by Richard Sherman, the co-chair of the Transitional Committee on loss and damage. Some of the interesting outputs or outcomes revolved around establishing institutional arrangements for the fund, the modalities and structure, defining the elements of the new funding arrangement, identifying and expanding sources of funding, and ensuring complementarity and coordination. And also, we were able to get a presentation. Just a moment. We also got another presentation from Dr. Salimul on exploring existing policy and institutional landscape in LDC countries to inform mechanisms for averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. Some lessons from the Transitional Committee with two really interesting outcomes in terms of improving South-to-South collaboration in the loss and damage agenda, and also a really interesting suggestion on a special envoy on loss and damage proposal by to be appointed by the UN Secretary General. Further to that, we also discussed about the normative and scientific research approaches and how this would interlink between the hard science and the softer science in terms of communities and how we're able to reach them. We had a presentation on the role of philanthropy in expanding the space for advancing the loss and damage agenda by Titus from Open Society. And he highlighted the connection between the countries responsible or the developing nations responsible for the mess that we are in at the moment and how philanthropy can be able to really come to support frontline communities. So that was the first session that we had. Nicholas finished it off with key perspectives. And I'd like to start with Nicholas so that he can give us high-level highlights on the key perspectives from an analytical report on the loss and damage. Nicholas, just 2 minutes, please. Okay, while he's still preparing. We went into group work and really discussed some interesting topics after an introduction by Yared, the summary of the key processes related to loss and damage that require our technical input. And some of the messages coming out is to keep momentum from COP27 and operationalization of the Santiago network on loss and damage to build up in terms of the advisory board and the host organizations, and just really connect that. Is this loss and damage? Yeah, they're damaging. Okay, so I think for me, the really interesting bit of the day was the group task in terms of identifying institutional designs, the proposals on arrangements and how that will look like, modalities of the structure and governance, detailing the terms of reference for the loss and damage fund. Then we had a session on defining the elements of how the new funding arrangements would be, and linked to this is the new sources of funding, and really interesting suggestions that came out from the groups. Then also we were able to discuss identifying, ensuring coordination and complementarity, and making the fund fit for purpose. We had some really interesting discussions on that, and existing operating entities and how that will look like. And that session segued into a short documentary on the evidence of climate-induced loss and damage in Malawi that we saw. I think that was from Trocare. And we ended the day with a roundtable discussion in terms of what technical inputs do we have to submit to the technical committee, to the transitional committee. The panel made up of Julius Ngoma from CISONEC. Some of the key highlights were funding arrangements to be operationalized as quick as possible, to ensure the process for scientific and other resources, sources of data is prioritized and supported through a blended approach to enhance decision-making. And also that the funding arrangements shouldn't take us back to what we've experienced with other funding mechanisms, such as the GCF. And also it should be able to respond to emergency situations. Ben Wilson was also able to share with us some of his highlights in terms of understanding and not having confusion on what loss and damage is. So by that is a multifaceted approach in terms of the political and technical terms, and inherently putting climate justice at the fore of our undertakings. Ownership of the process will be great. The successes that we had at COP27 will need us to build the momentum and really carry forward this agenda. And the fund will be a centerpiece and operating entity such that this mechanism is able to link to the frontline communities. Our other panelist was Richard Sherman, who spoke before, and he spoke about the need to be inclusive in our work with communities. Challenged PACJA at the next ministerial committee meeting to start plans for developing countries to prepare their loss and damage plans, which is a good, to set up their priorities and in a timely manner so that they're able to collect additional resources. And a key part is the capitalization of the fund in terms of rallying the call to replenish the fund once it is established. And lastly, the scientific angle also came out strongly, that governments need to be engaged so that they're able to trigger, when an event is triggered, they're able to tap into their funds and link to their communities. Yes, then our last panelist was Dr. Augustine, who spoke towards having concrete submissions to the transitional committee, which is quite useful, and establishing institutional arrangements, governance structures, TORs for the fund, as well as having clarity on what should not be included, what should be included and what should not be included. So in summary, that's how our day unraveled yesterday. I'd give the gentlemen at the podium maybe 2 minutes each to give us any quick thoughts. Then we can wrap it up from there and maybe take questions and comments from the audience. Nicholas, are you ready? Just hit your mic and you can give us just a summary of the presentation you made yesterday. Just key highlights, please.
Okay. Thank you, Philip. Yesterday, I made a presentation on behalf of Robert Mudami on key issues from analytical report by PACJA on loss and damage in Africa, which basically was a study that was commissioned by PACJA sometimes in December last year. The report is now available in draft form. It is being refined before it could be shared broadly to many. And yesterday, I think we are looking at the aspect of framing of loss and damage from an African perspective based on lived experience, and also borrowing from the literature that was reviewed and the key findings. I think one of the sticking findings of the literature review was that we cannot discuss loss and damage without mentioning the historical perspective to it in terms of our journey from the colonial period up to post-colonial, where we find ourselves in terms of the exploitation that happened then, the extractive of resources from Africa by the developed nations that were colonizers, and how that exploitation was part and parcel of their pollution, which is actually driving the present loss and damage and the future loss and damage that we are going to experience. I think that was a key sticking point. And then the other thing that was also coming out very clearly is that African countries, that's what the study findings point to, African development is dependent largely on sectors that are sensitive to climate change. And therefore loss and damage is resulting from climate change is likely to drive even greater inequality and poverty, and even undermine the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals, even as we are only 7 years to 2030 as we speak today. The other thing that was also coming out is that the evidence of losses and damages in Africa are obvious and available in terms of the lived experience of those who have been affected, in as much as some people would argue that not so many scientific studies have been conducted and documented and perhaps filed in peer-reviewed journals. I think that is a critical aspect that we need to point out, and really building on what Professor Hack of ICAD said yesterday, that I think we are not disregarding that high-level kind of scientific research like the ones which are published in journals, but we should also pay attention to normative research and even lived experience of those who have experienced climate change-induced loss and damage. Then, of course, the other critical aspect that came out from the presentation that I made and the report that will be published indicates is the long journey traveled in terms of the UN climate negotiation in relation to loss and damage, which is, of course, in the domain and knowledge of many of you, which I really don't want to dwell on. And that has been like 30 years down the line until COP27, when the nations or the parties agreed on establishing a loss and damage fund. The other critical aspect that the report, which is in draft form, brings out is really what the new and loss and damaging arrangements really means for Africa. How do the African countries prepare so that they are ready when it will be operational? I think that's one thing which also the study finds out in terms of recommendation for African countries to update their NDCs to include loss and damage. And also some examples are cited of a few countries that have strived towards really mainstreaming loss and damage into their NDC, even by way of mention. But the study actually points out that most, if not all, of the NDCs of African countries don't have anything to do with loss and damage. And that one points towards a gap which should be addressed or bridged before the loss and damage fund is established. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. The really interesting points from our discussions yesterday. Mr. Philip Kilonzo, you chaired the session for the groups. I'd kindly request, what are you hearing and what's coming out from the discussions from the group and the feedback that you've been getting? What kind of issues should we look like? Just a quick summary. If you can take 2 to 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Nicholas, for your kindness. And thank you again for saving me a lot of energy by emphasizing that I stick to less than 3 minutes. Actually, I need to take 2 minutes. And basically say that yesterday we had quite an engaging session through which we were able to clearly delineate all the key processes that are related to the transitional, to the work that the Transitional Committee on Loss and Damage is pursuing. But equally within that particular process, we were able to map out a richer ecosystem of processes that we need to also influence in quite a significant manner. And therefore, the more important part of it was that all these processes require us to be well prepared. And I think the sessions that we had yesterday, beginning from the technical political sessions that we had, began to give us clear snapshots of key messages that we need to take across to all these spaces, and more usefully began to indicate to the nature of organizing that we need to have, and the higher spaces that we need to approach again and create what we call actually invent new spaces that were never there for purposes of really advancing and elevating the loss and damage agenda in higher spaces. So that came out quite clearly. I think in terms of the detailed discussion on our detailed submission to the Transitional Committee, what is aptly clear is that we are still being called on to be more precise, more specific, more precise, more specific in terms of our request, while judiciously borrowing from lessons of other institutional setup within the UNFCCC. We are also being warned of potential risk of copy and paste, and therefore the loss and damage infrastructure should depart from the institutional setups earlier established to create a fund that is quite proximate to communities at the front line of climate crisis, and that is easily accessible. That departure must be manifestly apparent within the institutional setup, modalities of operation for GCF, the manner in which it raises funds, the core accountability mechanisms that are going to be instituted, and the broad policy framework. All these measures must clearly be tempered with to provide space within which frontline response can be accelerated through this particular fund. But again, what also came out yesterday is that we may, if not quite focused, end up with an empty shell in terms of GCF, empty shell in terms of the fund for loss and damage, unless we are conceptually clear on where the fund will come from. We are not taking the burden back to less developed countries and African countries, or developing countries broadly. We are not taking the burden there, and developed countries must duly take responsibility and avail the much needed resources. And we are open again to pursue these discussions for the establishment of the fund, pretty well knowing that there will be sufficient pledges that will be coming from the North. In absence of that, then we do not foresee much substantive resources within the fund, and we may go back to the liability and discourse, which is extremely critical in this particular matter. So allow me to pause there. I think there is much more than what we can actually summarize within this particular session. Luckily, again, we usually have all the recordings of all the discussions for purposes of review and purposes of subsequent engagements. Thanks.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you, Philip, for that quick summary. We'd like to hear from you. So we'll take maybe a few minutes. Any reflections, questions from the floor? This side, to my right, going once, twice, no one. This side of the pillar, anyone? Going once, twice. All right, thank you for being a lovely audience. Before I release these gentlemen, I ambushed them, so my life is in danger today. If you find me missing, I'll send them off with a special clap so that they're happy. So we'll do the locomotive to appreciate them. Do you remember the locomotive? Shall we begin? Yeah, thank you very much. I hand it over back to Julius. Philip, I think you might need to, I might need to hand it over to you to run the next session. Thank you. Welcome.
Good morning once more. Young men are good in ambushing elders. And you know, elders sleep having organized their bomber, not the bomber. They just organize it, and then as they sleep, they are clear about how things will fall in place the following day. So the moment you organize you disorganize an elder, they find some difficulties in finding their footing. Let me take this moment to welcome you all who are here physically, as well as the online constituents, to this important segment of this particular symposium. This is a segment where we develop and share externally facing messaging. So this session is particularly devoted to externally facing messaging. If you recall very well, so that we do not mix up issues, yesterday we went through an elaborate process of trying to look at the nature of inputs that are required to be transmitted to the transitional committees on loss and damage. And we went to group tasks and generated quite significant inputs. And we had further discussions on the same. But in the morning sessions, there were political discussions around where we need to vest our priorities. So those political discussions, some segments of what came out of the discussions related to the technical inputs that you go to the transitional committee is what actually constitutes the core of this particular session in terms of developing a communique. There are elements, of course, that have been spoken in a random manner as we were processing, we were still moving on with the process of this particular symposium. Any element that is of significant political importance then becomes part of the communique. So the communique to us is more of an externally facing political statement that is actually meant for those responsible to sort of take some certain instructive elements around it. So that is the essence of it. So it is not the technical submission to the transitional committee on loss and damage that we are going to share now. We are basically sharing politically oriented statements that should go to the right parties. In our quick assessment and our reflection, we did realize that there are people that we need to call to order, beginning with global community, largely the developed countries, the UNFCCC as an institution charged with the mandate of coordinating climate response globally. We also have African leaders who are quite critical. We have the transitional committee on itself, which has also other responsibilities among other entities. And therefore the communique that we are we have begun to process speaks to those particular elements. Without much ado, let me first invite Philip, because he also ambushed me, but this time I'm not ambushing him. He's rightly in the program to walk us through the communique. I hope you manage to projector it so that people can also walk with you as you read through it. That is what I'll ask of you. If you can manage to project, I think that would be greater. But I'll also assert that as we do that, we receive some comments which we've not been able to incorporate. We'll do that at the right time. We would have loved to incorporate them, but the owner of the comments saved them somewhere in the server, in the cloud. And our answer are too short to reach the cloud. So we are trying to get him to give us access to the cloud so that we get those statements and incorporate them. So that's what I'll also mention for purposes of being together. I'll emphasize that not everything that counts can be counted. And not everything that can be counted counts. And therefore, even as we walk through the communique, let's look at one, is it sufficiently addressing the fundamental issues related to this particular convening? And let's also look at whether the communique as it is captures the statements that are right deep at our heart. And therefore, if those it is targeted to are able to read it, then they will be well instructed in terms of what role and what responsibilities they need to lead. So that is what we just need to look for in the overall statement. And then if we are in agreement, we will end the session with adopting the communique. As members of this particular process, we'll end the session by adopting the communique, which will be part of our one of our broad political, one of our broad output, which will basically use for purposes of advancing our advocacy across all the spaces. So that is the quick guidance that I can provide for that even before it's presented. Secondly, in terms of the technical inputs, I think you gave us useful inputs, and we will continue to process them. We are hoping that by Monday, we should be in a safer space within which we can say now these inputs can actually go out. So all that much talk was just in the spirit of hogging the space for Philip to be set. Please proceed and walk us through the communique as it is, and then we will incorporate observations and comments from the floor. Thanks.
I'm back. Thank you, Philip. In the spirit of intergenerational equity, elders also have a strategic way to ambush, but they use interesting terms. So I'll guide you through what you consider to be our consolidated approach towards communicating our common position from the continent to the world, particularly targeting the transitional committee. The team is working to display it so that you can follow, but I'll just, I'll be good. So I'll just highlight, then we can take a round of questions and comments just to build it up. So the title is Africa CSO's Call on the Global Community to Act Fast and to make loss and damage facility operational with adequate and highly accessible funding through the partnership of the great organizers, the organizations represented here. And in quickly reflecting that on the findings of the IPCC assessment report 6, the synthesis report, in the projection of more intense extreme weather events in heat waves, droughts, floods, and storms and wildfires. And on further reflection, what is the economic impact of this with an accrued annual losses of more than 7 billion in the last decade between 2010 and 2020. Which we project to rise in the next 2 decades up to 50 billion USD due to the high emission scenario. And this could reduce the gross domestic, the GDP in Africa by 2 to 4% by 2040, projected to around 25% by the year 2100. Now we're taking into account the testimonials, which are important in African narratives, of the lived realities of communities that are experiencing losses and damage on all forms and magnitude, as they grapple with the climate shocks, similar to the tragedy that happened here in Malawi in terms of Cyclone Freddy, but more than that, the seafront erosion and the heat waves, as I've mentioned before. But we're also cognizant that COP28 is the cutoff point for operationalization of the loss and damage facility, and therefore the accountability expectations on part of the Transitional Committee on Loss and Damage is high. The sad reality that disturbs us is that the March type loss and damage fund may just be an empty fund with no money collectively, unless we as African actors amplify our voices, engage the global community, and also link to our local communities with reducible minimums for COP28 to create a much needed sense of urgency for making the facility fully functional. In that sense, we draw reference to institutional arrangements on other funding mechanisms under the UNFCCC that have adopted a business-centered approach and have adjusted the global business cartels and have largely remained inaccessible and unresponsive to the plight of communities at the front line of the climate crisis. We are reiterating that the magnitude of losses and damage will continue to grow unless urgent action to cut on emissions by developed countries are instituted alongside stronger accountability oversights, heightening the moral imperative of polluting dirty energy-based corporates who are minting profits in the billions as the world grapples with the stark reality of the financial resources for funding for climate actions which are inadequate. We reiterate that the urgent need to mobilize funds to address concrete losses and damages now and in the near future, while recognizing that climate justice principle of polluter pay is solely at the center of our submissions. So with this background, what is our call? So we hereby call that, submit that the loss and damage fund as a matter of principle should be locally led, broad-based, and adopt a whole society approach that is gender responsive. This clearly came out in our engagements in the last 2 days, and it's accessible to communities at the front line of the climate crisis as well. All right, so as a first point, so point number 2, the urgency in delivery of the facility for financing loss and damage alongside the adaptation actions in the African development priorities in finance to trigger much more investments at the local level again. So that locally led adaptation actions are promoted, and this trickle down these resources trickle down to the communities who are heavily impacted by the climate crisis. Thirdly, whereas loss and damage was conditionally admitted as an agenda in COP27 without liability or compensation on part of the developed countries, we take cognizance that the polluter pay as a guiding principle in reparations for climate justice is critical to our cause. And in this regard, we call on developed countries to explore and mobilize the much needed public funding to inform grants for financing loss and damage. Our fourth submission is a call for the establishment of carbon-based taxation measures for corporates involved in dirty energy and related value chains, with half of those profits being taxed and ring-fenced for the loss and damage fund facility. We submit fifthly that the funding for loss and damages should be principally from public funds. And pursuant to this position, we denounce the application of market-based mechanisms, such as the Blue Shield for responding to loss and damage, so that it's not for profit. We submit in our sixth point and call on developed nations, noting Germany, Ireland, and Denmark, to review the approach of investing funding meant for addressing losses and damages through market-based mechanisms. Our seventh submission is that while we recognize the role of scientific data and the importance in ground truthing, the intervention as a rationale for intervention, we note the urgency of the matter, and we call for greater flexibility to use other forms of evidence to make decisions and inform action for the application of this fund. I think this came out clearly when we were discussing yesterday. How do we build the evidence from other forms of data as well? Our eighth submission is that we call upon the UNFCCC to set, mobilize and deploy resources to support African countries and other LDCs in implementing national readiness programs for loss and damage to enhance capacity for country-level leadership and a coordinated response. Our ninth submission is that we call on developed countries to stop the destruction of lives and livelihoods and undertake urgent actions to cut on emissions as an imperative on climate justice, as we've said before. So this action for us must be accompanied and scaled up in terms of delivery of support on the adaptation programs within the continent. Our 10th submission is a call on our northern counterparts to ensure that the loss and damage funding facility is not delayed at COP28 through flimsy, self-serving, procrastination, technocratic arguments that have no bearing to the suffering of masses of communities in Africa and other less developed countries. Our 11th submission urges the Transitional Committee on Loss and Damage to judiciously borrow on existing policy frameworks and tested approaches from the Scottish Loss and Damage Fund so that we're able to anchor such recommendations on expedited disbursement of money under this fund at the latest by COP29. Our 12th point is that we urge the Transitional Committee to recommend inaugural call for the replenishment of the Loss and Damage Fund at COP28. Number 13, we call on private investments in Africa to undertake due diligence necessary to reduce on potential losses and damages inflicted by such investments, and for the governments in Africa to implement comprehensive and coherent policy and legal reforms to prevent future environmental and climate injustices. Our 14th submission is that whereas all measures for Africa must take control of the carbon markets, they must be accelerated through legal, policy, and negotiations. In this regard, we call on political leadership to be careful not to be derailed in this pursuit for urgent measures that will lead to a climate-just global regime. And in its priorities for the COP28, carbon trading, in our view, must shift from being the business of the affluent to benefit communities at the front line without derailing the core call for developed countries to cut on their emissions and delivering the much needed funding for victims of climate-triggered disasters. And our final submission is a call to the General Secretary of the United Nations to establish the Office of the Special Envoy on Loss and Damage so that we're able to improve better coordination in UN agencies in promoting this track of climate response, and as discussed yesterday, to support the Transitional Committee within the engagements. I beg to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philip, for walking us through those particular statements, which are also based or premised on a background. I want at this point to recognize that there were quite a number of people who were involved in this particular process of piecing this particular communique. Can I request all those who are involved to stand? Interestingly, some of us, we were interacting online. And I know there is a guy called Tom who is also online. So those who are present here, can you stand? Those who are here, can you stand? Probably I'll start from Philip, you are now known. Is there someone behind this pillar? I guess no. You want to introduce yourself? You know Nicholas very well. So Nicholas needs no introduction. Where is Julius Goma? Julius is somewhere who is well known. Jared? Is Jared around? And there were others whom I'm not seeing at this point. Dunia, I know she was part of that. So do not hide. I know you were part of that particular process. Chimwemwe, is she here? So I know it was quite a team that was behind the process, but I'm happy that we've been able to steer the process. Julius, in absentia, we mentioned you that you've been part of the team that has been steering this process. So what we've done is to aggregate. Thank you. You can take a seat. What we've done is basically to aggregate the thoughts that were coming through, and they are now presented in form of this communique. Can I, at this point, welcome comments and observations? I'll start with Charles. You were part of it. Okay, let me start with Charles. Can I request Philip and other colleagues just to take those comments on board so that we are able to quickly incorporate them, and we close. Charles, proceed.
Thank you, Philip. I was not necessarily part of the team, but I only gave them more support. I saw them seated somewhere at the lobby. I don't know whether they slept working on that document, and we really appreciate that commitment. I have one comment, and this regards to some words in the statement, especially market-based mechanisms. And we are saying we are against the market-based mechanisms when it comes to addressing loss and damage. And I know in our mind, what we want to mean is that we don't want schemes like insurance schemes, which are in themselves force, solutions. But I think I would really want us to change those ones, so that we are more direct, that we really are against some of those solutions that may not work, the business-based models. Because if we use market-based mechanisms, immediately people will think we are making reference to Article 6, and that we're referring to 6.4 or probably 6.2, which is not necessarily the case, because market-based mechanism has that connotation. Really, that we might be construed to mean that we are against market-based mechanisms at Article 6. So change that language so that it's clear that we are talking about insurance schemes and the others. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charles. It keeps coming back to me anyway. And apologies. I think I should have recalled it. Well taken. Proceed. Good.
Thank you, Chair. I also wanted to allude to the aspect of, I think it has been captured, the carbon tax, whether that also includes fully the principle of polluter pays principle, because in our group, I think we emphasize that much, that it should be emphasized, and that probably we should be as creative as possible to introduce other aspects that would ensure that anyone who damages the environment pays in a way. So I'm not so sure if the carbon tax that has been mentioned there includes this principle. Thank you.
Thank you for that particular observation. Broadly, yes, we are in that particular spirit of trying to see how best the polluter pays principle can be applied in a much more broader scale. Probably we may need to relook at the framing within the statement, not only to go for historical responsibility and the current responsibility, but also to strengthen the application of that principle in all business endeavors globally. If we can actually look at the polluter pays and its application. But the payment must be punitive. That is what I just want to emphasize. The payment must be punitive. If it's not sufficiently punitive, then we go back to square one. I'll pollute because I can pay. because there is general practice for people to pollute because whatever they are meant to pay is peanut, it's insignificant. So it must commensurate the damage. But of course, there are other principles that we must also take into account, the precautionary principle. And I think the precautionary principle calls upon us to do sufficient due diligence. Within this particular statement, you will see that we've incorporated the due diligence element, which is quite critical and which is more sustainable in context of cutting emissions and in context of cutting further damages to the environment. But we'll check on that language to ensure the spirit that you brought out is well espoused within the statement. More comments, I'll go right in the Mindu. When I say Samande or Samande, just to stick to our native names. Proceed.
Samante is the name. So, well, I noted something in, I think it was point number 7 in the communique, whereby we acknowledge that, yeah, we can use the scientific led evidence. And then in the same statement, then we also say that they should also acknowledge other forms of evidence. I think the others is quite ambiguous for me, especially if we want, it waters down what we brought out yesterday, that it should be community-led. So even though we may not put all others, but can we say community-led and others maybe, instead of just saying that we acknowledge that yes, we can use the scientific evidence and other evidences. I think that is a bit too broad and it waters down what we really talked about yesterday, that at least we should try to stick to community-led evidence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Samande. I'll actually assert that that original version of what you've said was the original version. That is what I'll quickly assert. And in the spirit of the drafters being brief, lumped it under other, we will resuscitate it. In interest of the strong opposition that you've raised, we will resuscitate it so that the scientific and community-led are broadly brought out and others. So that is how we will frame the statement so that again, the community-led component becomes strong. We just muted it. So we'll now resuscitate it in a stronger way. Daktari Kaugelo.
Thanks, Philip. Firstly, I just want to congratulate the team that worked on the document. It's quite clear and straightforward. I just want to add 2 points to what has been presented, and some are follow-ups from inputs that we got from colleagues. The first one is on the polluter pays principle. The manner in which we have structured the commentary in the document, I think we still need to relook at that. And I saw that there's a need that we need to be punitive in our approach when we look at the polluter pays principle. And I've seen a 50% of their profit that will be required for them to allocate towards the loss and damage. However, I just think that we should look at other options as well. The options whereby we consider that as advocacy groups, we still need to also look at ways in which we can create awareness to our businesses to make them understand the level of impact that they are causing, of which they are already understanding it. However, to shift a bit to say, we don't always have to look at you as the guilty part, and we can shift from the us and them approach, whereby we come together as citizens and find ways in which we can invest in loss and damage. And I'm saying this because most of the industries, I'll give an example of the mining sector. They do have what is called the CSIs, and as well as the social labor plans, where they allocate budgets to assist communities within which they operate to deal with various impacts that they might be experiencing, be it social, or be it educational or health challenges that they might be experiencing. So my take would be, in some instances, you find that those budgets are not completely used up. We can work with them to say, can't you allocate some of the budget towards loss and damage? That can just be one of the options in addition to the punitive measures that we put to the fore. And then the second part is around the nature of this fund. I saw a statement that speaks to us considering having grants. And my question to the colleagues in the room is that, can we be as firm as possible to say we don't want loans completely? We don't want loans. Can it be 100% grants? I know it's difficult, it might be difficult, especially for those that will be sitting in negotiations to negotiate this. But as Africa, this is the beginning for us to start making inputs. And as our point of takeoff, we become as firm as possible to say our countries are already indebted. We cannot compromise and say this loss and damage fund should take any form of loans. Thanks.
Dr. Kaugelo, you are quite spot on, probably reflecting on the discussion that I had with colleagues. Your last statement is quite sufficiently strong, and it will be considered by the drafting team for incorporation. I think it's quite strong in terms of making it clear that we do not want loans. I think we'll just add that bit of statement because we are knowing, we all clearly know that climate change is actually contributing to the level of indebtedness of this particular continent. So that's something that we'll put forth. On the business and the investment in terms of loss and damage, yes, we had that bit of conversation, which is very critical, but we were also clear on where we are pointed, where we are pointing and where we are looking on this particular statement. We were looking at processes largely above national level. And therefore that became quite critical for us in terms of premising the statement. And that is why we did not go back to that element, because yesterday we had quite a substantive discussion that clearly pointed us to the dichotomy that needs to be there in our engagement. Domestic resource mobilization for purposes of strengthening our DRR response should stand on itself, but our agitation for a facility that serves the interest of Africa in terms of loss and damage must remain pointed and directed towards those who are quite responsible globally. So that is the direction that we took in this particular statement. Be it that we are going global, I know Dr. Kaugelo, you know where the conversation around a binding treaty on business and human rights hanged. It's still there, it's not moving. And any effort to make it move an inch is also not moving. So essentially, I think the social charter that us as community have then plays in this particular context. And therefore we are called upon to strengthen our grassroots level work to hold the corporates to account. I've seen an hand on this direction. I've seen 3 more on this side. So I'll take the 4 hands, and I'll assume we are sufficiently in the right spirit. Let me begin with my dear sister and then come to the front and then, okay.
Thank you, Chairperson, and thanks to the team that drafted the communique. Mine is, I'm seeking clarification. What I've heard over the past few days is that there is an opportunity for us to make a submission to the transitional committee. So I'm trying to understand if the communique is developed in this spirit, or we are looking at it as an outcome from this meeting. Because also when I look at the entire document, I see there is an opportunity for us to really work on a submission and give it to the transitional committee, but also the tone might not currently be structured as a submission. So I wanted to seek that clarification. The second issue is on the discussion around carbon markets. I did not get it very clearly, but just to state that some organizations like ours, like AFSA, we are not very comfortable with proposing carbon markets, and we do not support carbon markets as a form of any climate mitigation, adaptation, or payment. So I just wanted to get that clarity. How are we putting this across?
Thank you. I'll provide you that quick clarity. Number one, this symposium was on loss and damage. It was not on carbon market. The only reason as to why a statement around carbon market sneaked into this statement is because we must continue to raise sufficient consciousness among the political class in this continent, because there is an effort to derail priorities for Africa. Right now, if you look at a number of countries, their focus has almost like become more on strengthening their policy legislation around carbon markets. Some are even thinking about how best to establish banks to deal with carbon market issues. That is diversionary tactic. When you look at the pressure from Europe, there is sufficient pressure that is also building in that particular direction, which is also a diversionary tact. So that's why we just put that particular statement to keep the discussions focused on the priorities around ensuring that the facility for loss and damage is operationalized. The adaptation funding is scaled up substantively to meet our needs, and developed countries cut on their emissions. So that is why we went back to that particular statement and brought it on board. Yes, indeed, we are quite uncomfortable, but position across Africa is also varied in regard to it. But then again, probably it's also high time to revisit that in light of what Charles said earlier, just to ensure that it's not, again, a mechanism for greenwashing. I know Charles will make a substantive addition to that. Charles, you want to step in before I come to the second comment?
Yes, allow me to actually respond to my sister. And I want to communicate also the PAC's position when it comes to issues of carbon markets. And I agree with you, my sister. We are also a bit apprehensive, to recommend carbon markets really as any, form of mechanism that can support, Africa to build its resilience. And we say that because we have varied reasons to believe that this is one of the 4 solutions proposed, in the market, just like the geoengineering, technologies that are being sold as ways of properly capturing, carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The reason as to why we are not necessarily proponents of the same is because we realize that the amount of resources that come as a result of the so-called carbon markets really is not commensurate with the kind of effort that are put in terms of generating those tons of carbon equivalents. If you look at $5, payment for 1 ton of carbon equivalent vis-a-vis the amount of effort, and foregone opportunities in terms of investment, that comes with the same, you realize that it really doesn't make a lot of sense. But somebody would argue that PACJA is also in red plus. It is true. We have been the African Civil Society or World Bank intermediary for civil society capacity building on red plus, and we have been engaging in that particular front. But we said we must be able to engage from inside. And the reason as to why we, of course, in it is because we believe red plus, in itself also being a carbon sort of a market mechanism, it supports us in terms of sustainably managing our forest, because communities are now better involved in terms of forest conservation. The communities have got a say in terms of how forests are governed. But to the extent that we're talking about the money that accrue, from the sale of those tons of carbon equivalent, it doesn't really make a lot of, sense, to our people. So I want to make that clarification that we are not proponents really of the carbon market as sure mechanisms to bring us where we are. But because it's a concept that is here with us, we engage, but we engage, with a lot of caution. And our position has always been that really we don't get value, for investment in terms of those carbon markets. And maybe just put one more point, and maybe this has been mentioned, maybe I didn't hear, Philip. I think it's still important, especially when you're addressing the position of committee. It's important to continue putting forth the fact that this loss and damage facility really must be seen as new and additional. And we are saying it must not eat into other facilities, especially adaptation fund. Remember, like I mentioned yesterday, the whole concept of loss and damage, you know, if we present a proposal from Africa and somebody else present a proposal, you know, from the small island states, your proposal will probably not be looked at. But the small island states, you know, have probably much more issues on loss and damage. I know we have our Cyclone Freddy and many other challenges, you know, in this part of Africa, but adaptation is really the biggest window that we have in terms of getting resources for resilience. So therefore, loss and damage must be there, but additional, but it must not eat into other facilities like adaptation. That we must really guard jealously from this side of Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charles. I know you lead in the front when it comes to carbon market discussions. And you can clearly see that. My dear sister, in terms of whether this the main output, probably you missed on the preliminary session. This symposium has a number of outputs. I think fundamentally we started with the first day serving to generate a number of studies and evidence. And those evidences are critical, but beyond just the evidence and the case studies that we shared here, it was meant to bring an awakening within the continent that evidence will be needed across, and calling upon the scientific community to scale up and to up their game in terms of providing the evidence that is needed within climate response, which is quite critical. So that's a starting point, which is quite important. The second output largely relates to the input that is going to the technical, the transitional committee on loss and damage. We said there were useful inputs that were generated, and that is work in progress. So we'll be able to pick that and proceed. The communique is a political tool for purposes of amplifying key and critical messages to critical stakeholders. So that's a quick response that I can give you on the on your first issue. Let me come to the front.
Thank you very much for the submissions. I just basically wanted to communicate on the issues to do with ownership of the communique. Of course, as you mentioned, it's a political tool at some point, but at country level, I think we need to own up on some of the key issues that are being highlighted with the regional representation. Of course, we need to map out the losses and damages in other regions, maybe in SADC, maybe in the EAC, in the EAC or elsewhere, so that all these collectively are documented. Because as you're talking about content development, in a way, we need to provide evidence that is also localized and can easily relate with the different country chapters. So I imagine that then there we are able to gain a collective voice to ask for the same demands in terms of clarity, basically in regards to the agenda. Thank you.
Probably I did not get you with clarity. When you talk about regional, you're asking about application of the communique. It's Africa in character. So when we talk about Africa, it's Africa in character. And what you also need to notice that some of the communities that we raise here are also judiciously borrowed by island states, and also some states in Pacific and also parts of Asia. So elements of that is actually borrowed. So even though we were calling it regional, it's regional in context of Africa, not regional in context of the southern region. So that's the clarity that I just needed to provide. There is somebody online. Let me just pick the comment online before I come to the two that are remaining that are physical.
Thank you. No. Oh. After you. This is, there is a chat from Dr. Lonis Sipuridis. Sorry if I am not spelling well the name, but he said IPCC's sixth assessment report recently publicized simply means much more LND for those countries and those people who are not responsible for the climate crisis. He also added that this sixth assessment is also a last warning to act. There is absolutely no time to lose. COP27 was not a success for loss and damage, but an over 30 years delayed recognition of an injustice committed by the global north to the global south. The COP27 decision on L&D is just an empty dress. At COP28, we need to add substance, or the substance required, meaning funds not at COP29. L&D is a continuous dynamic process. Since yesterday, more L&D was accrued. Every day, more is added. Loss and damage also has a history and roots in colonialism. This cannot be brushed aside. Philanthropy is good, but let it come after reparation. Time for liability to be recognized. Loss and damage has to be represented at the highest level in all COP discussions and committees. And that's from Dr. Loannis Siporidis. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that should be a participant who has been following us in a very consistent manner and who has been able to capture some certain elements of our discussion, which probably we could have missed. Again, back to the drafting team, there are elements in terms of that statement. I think one that can stand as a substantive request. And the other is much more strong in terms of reinforcing the preambular section. So Jennifer, just clip out that part, share with the team. We'll be able to pick some certain elements to enrich the preamble of the communique. I think it's quite spot on. Thanks. The online participant who wanted to speak, there is one more wanted to speak.
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me okay?
Proceed.
So I have one small comment firstly. The reference to the blue shield, should that be the global shield? Or maybe there's a blue shield and I've not heard of it before, but I think we need to also mention the global shield there. Secondly, I think it's a fantastic document, in particular, speaking as a Northern NGO, I think it's very important. This document will be important to communicate to them what the demands of climate justice activists in Africa are, because we know that these organizations and these governments often say that they're led by the South, but that's not always the case. And so therefore, I think we also need to be considering what platforms to share this communique at, to make sure that it's really being taken. You know, we're not just publishing it and sharing it and hoping that it goes somewhere, but making sure we're taking this to the Global North governments, Global North NGOs, and clarifying the demands of this symposium. In terms of edits, I think we need to maybe affirm more clearly all of the points that were made in the proceedings about the need for new money for the bigger pie and not rebranding of adaptation finance. So actually, I think a point which is very, very clear, and it can be added to one of the existing points, which says, we will not celebrate the rebranding of adaptation finance to be called loss and damage finance, unless this is new and additional and substantively different whatsoever. Because you know, a lot of Global North governments are now they're announcing money for loss and damage, but it's a rebranding. And I think it would be really strong for the symposium to conclude that they will not celebrate these actions. And secondly, in relation to this, I think there could be more of a substantive point made about what we need in terms of sources of finance. So that includes what was said about the reorganization of the global financial system, levies on international flights, like Professor Salim talked about, closing of tax havens, international climate tax, carbon tax, but also, and this is my final point, a call on parties in the Global North to introduce national levies to urgently raise new and additional contributions beyond development and climate finance for the loss and damage fund. I think that would be a very strong call, and it was something that was remarked upon by panelists in the proceedings. Thank you.
Tom, thank you for coming back. We had lost you for some time, and I'm happy that you are able to come back. Please just scribble what you've said in form of a text and pass it over to Jennifer. Jennifer is online. We'll be able to pick it and we'll incorporate it shortly. But I just want to check with you. I don't think I captured clearly what you want us to do with the blue shield within the document.
Well, I don't think I know what the Blue Shield is, but maybe I'm ignorant. But the Global Shield, the initiative launched by the G20, I think, and supported by Germany and Denmark and Ireland and others. I wondered if it should be referring to the Global Shield instead of the Blue Shield.
Thank you for that clarification. I am happy about that. Sorry, sometimes global can become blue during the night. And that is well clarified. Jennifer, you have one more observation, and I think it should be the last all 9, and then we pick the 2 more that are here.
We have 2 more speakers online that want to take the floor.
Jennifer, you said 1. Can we have 1?
All right, okay. Who goes first? The one who goes first is the one we are keeping. Thank you. Online
Hello.
participant, you can unmute. Yes, please go on.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Henry from Sierra Leone. Oh, yeah, it's just an addition based on the principles that have been mentioned, addition to the polluted space and that of the precautionary principle is the prevention principle and also the principle of differentiated responsibility with respective capability, just to reiterate. Well, the reason for the prevention principle, looking at if we trying to integrate that, it might help even result in reduce loss and damage. So the prevention principle moving, but also the participation principle, which also speaks to leaving no one behind, and the vulnerable people, persons with disability, women, and other vulnerable groups, indigenous people. So they should be at the onset of whatever intervention. Then also on the additional fund, the new and additional fund, this fund should be also gender responsive, and it should be flexible with no bureaucracy, because that is what we've been seeing in some of the underfunded windows. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Henry. We're happy to know that you've been following the discussion all the way from Sierra Leone. Let me come, who else wanted to speak online? Online, I'm just looking at online because I'm now being pressed with time. Jennifer, any other online constituent?
There is one more comment, but I don't know if he's still there. If you can hear me, please unmute and go on. Or
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, online participants can leave chat and we'll make sure that we pick your inputs and add them. Philip, I think we can proceed.
Great. I think I need to come to Reverend Phyllis. No, okay. So you appropriated rights. Proceed, madam.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, the team that put the committee together. I'm glad that most of the inputs have been captured from the research and the discussions. I have 2 points. The first is I really want locally led solutions to appear in the document, just as we are pushing evidence-based that we want from Africa. We should also push locally led solutions, and they should also be inclusive, just as we're pushing the evidence, because usually when these cyclones and everything else hit, we have communities, private sector, NGOs, governments, and research academia working within those districts that coming together to at least make themselves get back on their feet. For example, I'll give an example of Chikwao. When it's hit by floods, we have Ilovo, which is the private sector that works in Chikwao. It's mostly pushes forward for it to get back on its feet, to
still send sugar to the other parts of Malawi. The other part is I would want us to, just as we are pushing for grants, not loans, we should also push that we do not want insurance. Most NGOs, especially from the Global North, are pushing premium insurances, that we should be paying insurance so that when these cyclones hit, then we tap from that. We should say no to insurance. Thank you. Those are the two that I had.
Thank you so much. I think they are quite spot on, and it's just again rechecking the text to be sure that those elements are there. For locally led, I think that is captured, but we will again recheck to be sure. I think the insurance element has been exhausted. Henry, going back, I think you raised an important point. We will do a bit of reference to the Paris Agreement, common and differentiated responsibility at the onset of the document. In the preambular section, we will actually bring that forth so that it's strong. And then I'll cross over. The gentleman will finish this process. That is the chief. I'm assuming that's the chief. If it's the chief has the right to speak. Proceed, madam.
Thank you. Thank you for the great sentences that you have brought up, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to participate in this discussion. I also have 2 points. First one is actually same with her on that emphasis on locally led solution making, which will be powerful and need to be more emphasized on the document. And second one is that that we need to understand the transitional and keep changing essence of these disasters, so that this loss and damage fund should not be the like we need to make this fund and then after that we are going to do this and so on, but we need to keep responsive on that, so that after this disaster happened and after these communities are doing something, and then we need to again respond to that, so that we need to keep changing the system after on. So yeah, I think this would also be emphasized on the document. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I think if not the first statement, I think the second one is actually talking about the fund being broad-based. Broad-based is meant to ensure that we carry all these elements as we move with the response. My brother.
Yes, thank you. And just to join others to appreciate the good work that has been put together by our colleagues. 2 comments, maybe they've already been captured, but I felt I should also reinforce these points. Number one, for me, I think one of the things that we need to be prioritizing is that all the vulnerable countries, and now maybe there will be a question of how we define vulnerability. But I take countries which have experienced more than twice, the cyclones such as Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Malawi, and other countries, Madagascar inclusive. This should have an immediate access to loss and damage funding. One, because I think they're vulnerable in many ways, but also the poor countries, and the level of response usually is very problematic, and therefore they should be having that kind of immediate access to funding. My second point, maybe it may not be fit for the communique, but I felt, I think the RODF, if you may wish to call it that way, should learn from the previous funding mechanisms. GCF, for instance, it took about 4 years for it to be established. And again, take several years for countries to access funding or projects to access funding. And therefore would want to have the RODF really to have, to be distinct in a way so that it responds in a timely manner, but also it is set up to address issues in a very relevant, format, as so to speak. So it is to learn lessons from the previous funding, mechanisms. And in addition to that, I think it has to be distinct from other humanitarian funding. You know, it's not just about the general funding, but I think it's about the immediate loss and damage, which have immediate impact, medium-term impact, but also long-term impact to the people that, or the countries that have been affected. So it is to ensure that in that regard, the fit for purpose also comes into play, that we ensure that it is really distinct in the way it operates. My main concern is on irrelevance, but also on timeliness. Thank you.
Thank you for your observation. In terms of vulnerable countries, I'll also cross-check. I know the general language is developing countries, but indeed within developing countries, we know there are vulnerable countries. For us to be able to politically move this agenda forward, we are conscious that we'll need the political support of everyone. And we are clear that we need to begin to galvanize rather than fragment the political support that we need to move this particular process forward. So we'll look at that element of a proposal before we move forward. I think if not item 13, Philip, if I'm wrong, item 13, item 12 thereabout is actually not referencing 12. It's not referencing from learning from previous process, but also judiciously borrowing from the policy ecosystem. Remember what we are putting in place, the transitional committee will put in place at COP28 is the institutional mechanism for. But if that institution does not borrow on the existing policy ecosystem, then it will be forced to develop policies. And within the UNFCCC process of developing policies, it can even take 2 years. So that will delay. So our proposition was that the transitional committee recommends at COP28 that a decision be made to adopt the existing policies so that they facilitate its fast implementation of some of this program. In terms of distinction, I think you are quite spot on. Now, I think the interest has grown and people have realized I have a soft spot. Can the chief speak? And Maria, can you take 1 minute after the chief?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think let me applaud the team that has drafted the communique. It has covered quite a lot. However, my experience centers around what my 2 or 3 last colleagues have spoken about. I'm going to raise issues on politics, finance, coordination and networking. And probably very, very important is the judiciary system to be responsive, because at the end of the day, these policies and laws that we are talking about are supposed to be enforced. And that the thing that enforces those laws is the judiciary system. So there has to be a core of cooperation with the judiciary system to ensure that the policies and laws are implemented and supported by the judiciary systems. When you go in, there are these technicalities, the court cases, take 3-4 years. For example, the issue of plastic here in Malawi, it has taken over 10 years to do something about it. So the judiciary system is very, very important. Financing, private sector is very, very important. Just alluding to what Dr. Chipeta has just mentioned there, responsiveness. And the letter there also mentioned about Ilovo, which is a company that responds immediately. So there has to be a call for engagement of private sector, seriously, both at a local and continental level, in order to support the financing, because their financing is less restricted to these protocols, to these procedures. So the engagement of private sector is very, very important. Networking, I would think we need to bring into the discussion the African Forum for Graduate Advisory Services, because the actions on the ground are basically taken by the extensionists, who I see are not part of this process. So I know, for example, I've got a colleague in Mali we work with. We are doing the same things, but we are basically out of the scope of what is happening now. Of course, we started engaging in L&D about 3-4 months ago in January, but I can feel that we are really behind in the agricultural sector. on the issues of loss and damage. So they need to engage all the necessary stakeholders, especially at a continental level, because this is a continental meeting. The African Forum for Graduate Services needs to be engaged and be part of it so that they can disseminate these things further to the relevant extension authorities. Lastly, yeah, it's the issue of coordination that I've talked about. And I think that closes my case. And also, it is very, very important. I will now go down the local governments. There's decentralization that is going on, for example, here in Malawi. So at the end of the day, we have to also make sure that the message brings attention to those people who are focused on decentralization. Because when you look at Cyclone Freddy, the district councils now, all of a sudden, have become the most important people to implement these things, do the assessments. But power hasn't been devolved to them. It's still, we are dealing with headquarters. So everything has got to go to headquarters. So the district councils are not able to respond. So they are tied. So probably the community can also address those issues. I don't know how you can do it, but it's an issue that needs to be addressed so that at least at that level, people can know that there is a need to decentralize decision-making for loss and damage to be prompt in terms of occurrence and responding. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think your comments are quite spot on. We will also be listening in to look at what are the comments that should go to the Africa Climate Summit, because there is an African Climate Summit. Some of the observations and comments need to go there for purposes of substantive anchorage. In terms of coordination, we are, of course, quite clear that a number of African countries are not even ready in terms of the structures, the institutional structures that need to be put in place. And that might require some money. And that is why there is an explicit call within this particular communique on UNFCCC to explore, mobilize, and avail resources to support the scale of readiness that is needed for purposes of implementing the loss and damage fund within countries. So there is a statement in that particular regard within the communique that is available. On you brought in an important point that should go into the communique as a substantive point. I hope Philip is listening and the team. There is actually a substantive point, and it's about the judiciary playing its role. Judiciary does not work on faulty laws. If the laws are not there in the first place, if the policy frameworks are not there, then the judiciary will not work. So essentially, it's a call on legislators across Africa and at all levels, because we know there are regional legislative institutions, there is Pan-African legislative institution and national legislative institution in all forms. I think to lead in the process of enacting progressive laws that can again support judiciary in pursuit of liability for those liable to losses and damages. So we need just one additional statement that aptly calls upon legislatures across Africa to scale up the enactment of laws and policies, and the judiciary to step up their action in terms of interpretation of those laws in pursuit of liability for those institutions, private actor institutions that are within the continent of Africa. I think that is a substantive output, listening to what you said. Maria, close the session for us.
I am humbled to be accorded this opportunity, and I'll be very brief. Thank you so much for the team that put together the communique. Mine is just one slight observation, and is on the issue of gender. And I really wish if we can be considered bringing out the issue of gender in its substantive and constructive way, that it can stand either in preamble very strong, but all is coming up in its own paragraph. We understand the issue of gender, they're very broad, but if we just keep on sliding it somewhere and just mentioning it, we are losing that substantive content, which needs to come out very strong when we talk about the legislature, and others will be coming up to look in this document in the future. And the last one is building from what the participant online who spoke about on how the communique can be now be shared broadly. And given ourselves responsibility taking this to our own countries, I also see that the role that we need to play is seeing that how now other organizations, civil society and the governments in our own country now, they'll have this understanding of what transpired here in Malawi. I don't know in what context, but I find it very relevant given the other activities that are coming forward toward this year, to have this knowledge being shared prior, but also to be a continuous momentum to other civil society organizations, so that it does not happen in an ad hoc situation, but that understanding continue to be knocking and standing and be like a knowledge base to other civil society who maybe otherwise are not very conversant, or they are conversant, but they do not see the magnitude of how the civil society in African context need to understand and push forward the agenda from our national level and then coming up at the regional level. This is something that I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. We will look into that aspect with a view to producing quite a crisp, succinct document, but that again incorporates the views from all over. Again, let me take this opportunity to thank both the online audience and the physical audience. Sorry. So let me take this particular opportunity to thank both the online and the physical audience for engaging with this communique in quite a substantive manner. I think we've taken this opportunity not only to unpack the document, but also for us to have collectivized internalization of the document and what it entails. And also we've taken the opportunity also to internalize what the next steps mean. And I think that is quite useful for us. We want to go to a stage that is quite important. And that is a stage of adopting the communique with the observations. All the observation, the small team will actually quickly retreat, incorporate any observation that has come from the floor in the most judicious manner possible. And then the document will be readily available within the next 2 hours for online dissemination. And our intent as organizers of this particular conference is to ensure that the document is as widely disseminated as possible. Using the structure presented by the 120 participants who are part of this particular process, the online constituents, and through other platforms to reach other critical spaces for decision making. Our intent is by Good Friday, anybody who matters in this continent and anybody who matters within the space of climate response will have this particular document. So that is our intent, and we will work towards that. So by show of hands, just do like this. Do like this, do like this. Those are the 3 ways we will either adopt the document. This one means you are very happy about the document. This one means that you are not too sure. And this one means you are not approving it. 3 methods. So let's start by count of 1, 2. Okay, you can stand. It's also important to stand. Let's stand. Yeah, so by count of 1, 2, and 3. Where is the media? Where are the media people? Wow. That is quite an overwhelming cameras. Where are the cameras? Where are the cameras? We need the cameras. This is more monumental. This is quite monumental. We need the cameras. I think also the online audience could be raising their hands without our knowledge, but this is quite monumental. And let me take this opportunity with that seal of approval and speaking on behalf of the committee that was spearheading this particular process of developing this particular communique, indicate that we will, in a very judicious manner, take care of all your observation, and we will strive for you to have the document in the next 2 hours, fully signed off for wide dissemination. Thank you so much, and God bless you. Let me move the session, next session, to the next moderator, Madam.
Thanks so much again, Philip, and of course, all the moderators that helped in the morning. We are coming to the final session, and with your permission, we're supposed to have a health break, but with your permission, can I request that we finalize, conclude, and then we disperse? Is that agreeable? That's kind of a weak yes. Is someone really hungry? Oh yeah, someone is like already, yeah? All right, thank you so much. So again, my name is Teresa Ndanga, and I will be moderating this final session where we are closing our 3-day symposium on loss and damage. We started off on Monday, as you will all remember. And of course, we have had some rich discussions around how we are affected, hearing from those that have been directly affected, but of course, also looking at how we would want to move forward as an African region. We have developed a communique. I'm sure that it will be shared around for all of us to have a copy, but also that it will be shared with the relevant authorities. Allow me now to invite to the high table the following. Madame Sophie Kaonongera, who is the board chairperson, Civil Society Network on Climate Change. Mr. Evans Njewa, who is the Chief Environmental Officer in the Ministry of Natural Resources and Climate Change. Dr. Augustine Njamshi, who is the Chairperson, Technical and Political Affairs, Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. Thank you, Doc. Mr. Luke Teu, who is the Country Director, Christian Aid, Malawi. Dr. Ben Wilson, Advocacy Manager, the Scottish Catholic International Aid Fund. Oh, he is online. Thank you so much. Dr. Ben, I hope you can hear us. Welcome. Thank you so much. So this particular session, we will be hearing about the commitments that those that have invited to the high table have as we close this symposium. But again, you will remember that on the first day, we had a session where we were learning from lived experiences on loss and damage. And on that particular session, we were supposed to also have colleagues from Madagascar and Mozambique, but due to travel disturbances, they were not available at that particular time. So allow me that at this particular time, I just give them a few minutes, 3 to 5 minutes to just share quickly their lived experiences on loss and damage, how climate change has impacted them directly or their communities. How their lives has changed because of climate change. I will therefore invite a representative from Madagascar. Madagascar, are you in the room? Awesome. If you could please also come forward. A colleague from Mozambique. Anyone from Mozambique? Anyone from Mozambique who speak? Okay, thank you so much. Welcome. We will also hear from Chief Tengani. He's our local traditional leader in Nsanje. Again, he will just offer some brief, quick solidarity remarks because where he's coming from, it's one of the districts that have been hugely affected here in Malawi. Ulemu wa mfumu, Amalawi anzanga. Ulemu wa mfumu. All right, so we will start hearing from, so I'll invite you in a minute because of the sitting plan this side. So I'll invite you in a minute. We'll just start with Mozambique. Then we'll hear from Madagascar and we'll finish off with Chief Tengani before we hear from the commitments from the high table. So our colleague from Mozambique will speak to us in Portuguese, but there will be translation in English. A kind reminder, interpretation is available. Please make use of those headsets on the tables. Just giving it a few seconds so that we don't kind of interrupt our colleague who will be speaking. Thank you. So if you could, she could start with her name, introduction, her name, where specifically in Mozambique, and then share the lived experiences. I'm not going to asking questions because of time.
Okay.
Thank you.
Pode começar a apresentar-se, o seu nome e organização, se faz favor.
Obrigada, thank you. I'm Maria from Mozambique. Vou falar português.
I'm going to be speaking in Portuguese.
Bom, eu não vou fugir da realidade daquilo que eu acompanhei desde ontem.
I'm going to não vou fugir. I'm not going to drift away from the reality of what was shared yesterday related to the information.
Acompanhei que os ciclones que passaram por Malawi são os mesmos que passaram por Moçambique.
I can confirm that what happened in Malawi is similar to what happened in Mozambique.
E também acompanhei que os ciclones que passaram no Malawi foi Gombe, Ana e Freddy.
I can confirm that the cyclones that have passed through Malawi were Gombe, pardon, please.
Ana e Freddy.
Ana e Freddy.
Mas para nós em Moçambique passaram muitos ciclones.
But for us in Mozambique, there were many cyclones.
Dos quais foi Ana, Gombe, Freddy e Idai.
The ones that passed through Mozambique were Ana, Gombe, Freddy e Idai.
E desses quatro ciclones que passaram por Moçambique trouxeram muitos impactos.
These 4 cyclones that passed through Mozambique had many impacts, negative impacts.
Principalmente no que tange Ana e Freddy.
Especially when we focus on Ana and Freddy.
E Freddy neste momento acho que entrou para Moçambique, veio a Malawi e de novo voltou para Moçambique.
Specifically mentioning Freddy, what happened was it passed through Malawi, Mozambique, and then it went back to Mozambique.
E neste momento ainda sentimos o impacto do Freddy.
And in this moment, we still are facing the impacts of the cyclone Freddy.
E também temos que solidarizar com o povo malawiano.
And we also have to be solidary with Malawian people.
Porque as dificuldades são as mesmas.
Because the difficulties and issues are the same.
Então, sendo africanos,
And so being Africans,
Peço que tenhamos a mesma união e sigamos, tenhamos uma mesma agenda, de maneira como nós vamos ter que defender, ou como que nós vamos ter que defender esses impactos ambientais.
so I ask that we have the same agenda in facing these negative impacts.
Eu acho que esse simpósio trouxe a realidade daquilo que nós somos e vamos estar unidos para conseguirmos atingir os nossos objetivos.
I believe that this symposium has, sorry, pode repetir, se faz favor? Pode
Vamos estar
repetir.
unidos para podermos atingir os nossos objetivos.
I believe that this symposium has brought us together to be united to reach the same objectives and goals.
E muito obrigada. Eu acho que só foi comentário, não apresentação.
Thank you very much. This was just a comment. It wasn't a presentation.
Vamos continuar solidários. Muito obrigado.
We're going to continue being solidary, sorry. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. And indeed, you can tell that Malawi and Mozambique share so much in common. The cyclones that you mentioned, indeed, are also the ones that Malawi suffered. So we are in the same boat. Thank you so much for that. May I now invite Madagascar to please also come forward? If you could, if you could please come forward. Thank you. So again, we'll also spare some 3 to 5 minutes to hear from Madagascar's experience. You can sit at the, thank you. Will there be interpretation or English? Sir? So there will be interpretation, French, so make use of the headsets.
Bonjour à tous, je m'appelle Stéphane et je viens de Madagascar. Je m'excuse si je parle en français parce que le traducteur m'a fait part qu'il y a la communauté francophone qui sont en ligne, donc je vais essayer de parler en français. Je vais parler en français. OK, donc à Madagascar, donc le PowerPoint, on l'a fait en anglais. Et sinon, je vais essayer de parler brièvement, je vais essayer d'expliquer en français ce qui se passe à Madagascar. Tout d'abord, j'aimerais vous faire part que Madagascar est le premier pays impacté par le changement climatique dans le monde et l'un des pays les plus pauvres. Normalement, on aurait dû montrer les vidéos et les photos, mais on s'est dit que la dignité est plus importante que les photos et les dignités pour les Malgaches, pour nous. Comme par exemple, on a des gens qui mangent leurs chaussures. Vous pouvez taper sur YouTube. Les gens qui mangent des haches, et les terres et les dirt. Vous pouvez taper, ce sont les grands médias, ce sont les médias internationaux qui ont sorti. Sinon, par rapport à ce qui se passe à Madagascar, je pense que nous avons tous le même problème en termes de dommages et de pertes. On a tous le même problème. On connaît le problème, mais la solution, on le sait. La solution vient de nous tous. La solution est financière. Donc, est-ce que vous pouvez passer le slide, s'il vous plaît? The slide. Can you move it? OK. Donc, comme Comme on voit sur la photo, on a 5 cyclones durant l'année à Madagascar. 5 cyclones très ravageantes pour le pays. Can you move it, please? Oui. Je vais essayer de montrer les photos comme les impacts sont assez conséquents. Oui. On a le problème d'infrastructure comme nous tous en Afrique. Ça, c'est les photos de notre association. Ce sont les activistes au sein de notre association qui a pris. Ça fait des années que ça n'a pas changé. Ça fait 60 ans que cette route n'a pas été faite. Le dernier cyclone, c'est Reuters qui a donné des photos. On a pris les photos. So Madagascar as an island, the country is more vulnerable to its exposure to impacts of climate change. Climate change magnifies food insecurity in a specific region of Madagascar. The impact, as we know, health impacts, livelihood lost, malnutrition. So in summary, I want to share this commitment on loss and damage. We cannot wait. Nous n'avons pas le temps d'attendre parce que le monde, le Paris Agreement n'a pas été atteint. Et voilà, bon, bref, voilà quoi, c'était à la va-vite. Voilà, on tous ça en fait. On a le même problème, mais si ça ne vous dérange pas, si ça vous tente, je peux vous partager le USB driver de ce qui se passe à Madagascar. Merci à tous. En fait, merci à tous pour votre attention.
Thank you so much. Such a touching experience from Madagascar. Of course, as he said, for the dignity of the citizens there, he couldn't show some of the pictures of the reality that the people there are going through. But I think from what he said, it paints a picture of the dire situation that people are going through there, especially in terms of hunger. The situation is pretty bad. But as I said, Africa, the world is not on track, but of course, as Africa, we are at the far end of, or the receiving end of the impact of climate change. We probably need to do a bit more pushing because we are seeing the experience, or we are experiencing these issues firsthand. Thank you so much again, Madagascar and Mozambique. Allow me now to invite Chief Tengani, traditional leader here in Malawi, Nsanje, to be specific. He will also share his experience and of course of his people, what they are going through in terms of climate change. Nsanje is one of those districts in Malawi that frequently have floods. So, Afumu Olemwan.
Thank you very much. First and foremost, I want to thank the organizers of this symposium for taking the conference to the right place. I wish to also extend my thanks to the delegates for a wonderful contribution, and also to the presenters, wonderful presentations. My invitation to this conference has been a blessing to me, despite the sufferings of myself and my people. I didn't know that there are brains behind my sufferings, working on how best our suffering can be alleviated. Let me share with my colleagues that have been here the serious bad experiences that we have suffered as a result of the cyclones. For the first time in the history of this country, the country has lost more than 500 lives because of the cyclones. And to that effect, the president saw it fit to declare 14 days of mourning. And despite the mourning status, you thought that we should still take the conference to Malawi. I thank you very much for that. Yes, cyclones have brought a lot of suffering to the lives of the people. Despite the loss of life, there are also other forms of suffering. Houses have been demolished, livestock has been wiped away, the experience of my sister in Kenya. So I was particularly happy to see the kind of losses that you people came up with. The one of which affects me directly, the territorial loss as a chief, losing the whole village. It's a pain for me because I'm a chief because of my people. And if I see that the whole village has been wiped out, my headache is where do I take the people to? And I would be happy to see the fund also support the procurement of land where these people can be relocated. Most oftentimes we have land issues in this country, and not only in this country, but other countries as well. You find that for a person to relocate, he needs land, and for him to get land, he has to procure it. If he doesn't have money, there is no way he can manage to procure that land. So we rely on our respective governments to commit some resources to procurement of land for relocation. And because of that, let me also say that I'm happy with the agenda of climate justice, which is going to cushion our suffering very well. And issues to do with response, recovery, and rapidity. I don't know if this is going to be taken into account. Yesterday, we were discussing on issues of governance and of the fund and stuff like that. But one issue that I wish to ask the delegates is the first day we heard that 46 of the developing countries of the 46, 33 are in Africa. And this translates to the fact that the majority of the people that are suffering because of the cyclones are in Africa. And the question that I'm going to pose is, do we really want to have the Secretariat of the Fund housed in the headquarters of the United Nations when the majority of the people that are suffering are in Africa? So I would want to request that we all put heads together and fight for the headquarters of the Secretariat to be in Africa, where most of the suffering people are in Africa. There are also issues of one of the presenters yesterday, I think it's Philip, who said that response rate should not take more than 5 days after the disaster has occurred. So if we have the fund based in the United Nations headquarters, are we going to achieve that? So my fellow Africans, it's good that we are discussing the issue right now for the benefit of Africans. And yes, the climate justice will do its work. We need to put heads together to fight for our rights. Because let's take, for example, Sanje. It's a district that is waste heat when it comes to rising temperatures. Temperatures can go up to 40, 46, 47 degrees Celsius. when it's at its peak. So that kind of temperature, it's unbearable. And you look at the district, there are no industries that can pollute the environment. So we really need that fund, the just described fund, to do its work. And through the Director of Environmental Affairs, take my appreciation to the President. He has really stood by the people of Malawi during this suffering. And with those few remarks, I want to say thank you very much, the organizers and the presenters and the delegates. Thank you very much.
That's the kind of greeting we give the chief here in Malawi. Thank you so much, Senior Chief Tengani of Nsanje, for those rich remarks, touching on what exactly we have to demand for, being on the receiving end of the impacts of climate change, and yet we are not the perpetrators of this so-called injustice. Thank you again. Madam Taonga Mbale Luka, the Director of Environmental Affairs Department, Madam Sophie Kaunongera, the Board Chairperson, Civil Society Network on Climate Change, CISONEC, Mr. Julius Ngoma, National Coordinator for Civil Society Network on Climate Change, Dr. Augustine Njamshi, Chair, Political and Technical Committee of the PACJA Board, Mr. Kona Kelly, Programs Manager for TROCA, Malawi, representatives of the UN agencies here present, representatives of the academia and research institutions, journalists here present, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning again. We now get into the final parts where we'll hear closing commitments from those that are on the high table here. And of course, colleagues, one will join us online. Allow me now to invite Dr. Ben Wilson, who is the Advocacy Manager, Scottish Catholic International Aid Fund, Scotland, to deliver his closing commitment.
Thank you very much. Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Thank you very much to the chair. Thank you to Madam Taonga Mbale Luka, the Director of Environmental Affairs Department, to Madam Sophie Kaunongera, the Board Chairperson of CISONEC, to my dear friend Julius Ngoma, the National Coordinator for CISONEC, to Augustine from PACJA, to Connor and Maggie and colleagues from TROCA Malawi, and to all the representatives of UN agencies, of academia, of media houses present, to you, Teresa, the chairperson of MISA Malawi, and to all of you, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for all of your fantastic contributions to this really remarkable and I think groundbreaking event. I remember last year, I think in June 2022, sitting in Julius's living room in Lilongwe and talking about this very event, because at that point some money had been committed from the Scottish Government to fund loss and damage projects in Malawi. And we knew at that point there would be a need for an occasion to celebrate and to share some of the learning from that project. But we didn't realize back then that when we had that event, it would be bigger, as big as this. It would be a Pan-African event, not just for Malawi, but also that by that point we would have a significant breakthrough from the COP, an agreement of a fund for loss and damage. And I think that thinking back to back then and to what's happening now these past few days at the symposium, I take a lot of hope and encouragement from this event, because I think whilst we've of course discussed many of the challenges we face, which are so great, I think the resolve that all of the people here at the symposium have shown is even greater than those challenges. I think if I was to pick one thing which sticks in my head from these past 2 days, it's the comment from, I think, Titus yesterday from OSF, when he reflected on the family in Southern Africa who may have lost their lives drowned in mud following a climate event, compared to a family living a life of luxury and plenty in Dubai, in LA, or in Shenzhen. And I think that really struck a chord with me because it reminds us why we're all here, not just in solidarity with those people who are impacted by climate disasters, but also to stand up for the injustice that we live in a world system where some people live a life of such plenty, whilst others live a life of such little. And I think our collective fight for justice, whilst it's not an easy one, it's really important to maintain that hope. And I think that hope has really come from this meeting. I think what I would also take away from the meeting is that loss and damage is a site of resistance. Loss and damage within the UNFCCC structure it could be seen to be a moniker for trying to correct some of the injustices which are embedded in UN structures and embedded even in the Convention on Climate Change. It's about getting away from the idea that action on climate change is the individual responsibility of states, but a collective challenge that must be met on the basis of justice, and therefore the responsibility with the countries and the businesses which caused this crisis. But I think also loss and damage, and this is something else which has come through these past few days, gets to the heart of what we value as a society and as a planet, especially when we think about non-economic loss and damages. For a long time, the world has been characterized by an economic paradigm which places value only on the things which we can attach a number to, only on the things which have a monetary value in pounds or in kwacha or in dollars or whatsoever it is. But actually, especially in relation to non-economic loss and damage, it recognizes quite rightly that there are many, many things which we cannot attach an economic value to, which are nevertheless of great importance to all of human society across the whole world, whether we're talking about ancestral land, our connection to each other, grave sites, or indeed our loved ones itself who are being lost already to the climate crisis in our own families and within our societies. And I think all of these things kind of combine really, again, to just kind of strengthen in me that our resolve to act on loss and damage must stay true to ourselves and to those people who we are trying to represent here, that we must not get caught up in the incrementalist and technocratic solutions which are often proposed, especially by the Global North at meetings of the COP, and stay true to ourselves and to those people that we seek to serve when we are crying out for justice. And I'll just conclude by reflecting that sometimes things which seem impossible become possible. And again, when I'm reflecting back on the Scottish example, you know, we as NGOs went to the Scottish government in early 2020 to ask them to become a champion of loss and damage. And we were told that they would not. They told us that it was impossible for them to champion this issue because of the legal consequences of accepting liability for the climate crisis, because of the risk involved in them speaking out on this issue when they're not even an independent nation party to the UNFCCC. And yet, because the people of Scotland came together to put pressure on the Scottish government to make that commitment, what was once impossible became possible. And many of us were in COP27 in Egypt just a few months ago, and the achievement of agreeing the Loss and Damage Fund also felt impossible right up until the end, right up until a few hours before the conclusion of the conference. And these realities of what was impossible becoming possible changed because of collective action, because of visioning at meetings just like this one that we've had, and because of the hard work and the mobilization which many people in this room put in for a number of years to try to achieve what was once felt to be unachievable. And so therefore, I would just like to conclude by thanking all of the organizers, thanking all of the fantastic participants. And I hope that all of you, like me, take a lot of hope from this experience, and that we will continue to work together to build a more just world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ben Wilson, for those closing remarks. Indeed, it's not just about solidarity. It's also about joining hands together to demand for justice where we think that there is none. Thank you to the Scottish government for leading the way and showing commitment by pledging the money that, of course, on the first day, we already had the commitment of the £2 million, if you remember. And of course, for supporting projects around climate justice, climate change. Here in Malawi, we also saw there was a presentation on the first day about the same. So thank you so much again, Dr. Wilson, for those remarks. Allow me now to invite Mr. Luke Tembo, the country director, Christian Aid Malawi, to also come and deliver his closing remarks. If you could come forward, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Luke Teo. First of all, let me recognize the presence of the distinguished guests that are here. Mr. Evans Njera from the Department of Environmental Affairs, Madam Sophie Kamongera, the board chair for the Civil Society Network on Climate, CISONEC, Dr. Augustine Nyamishi, Chair, Political and Technical Committee, Puncture Board, Mr. Kone Kerry, Programs Manager for Trocare Malawi, the representative of the UN agencies here, representative of the academia and research institutions that are present here, representatives of the media houses present here, Teresa Ndanga, chairperson of MISA Malawi, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It has been a great honor for Christian Aid to co-host this regional event alongside CISONEC, Trocare, Puncture, SAFE, Concern, and CRS. The issues of loss and damage is one of the Christian Aid priorities and our climate justice thematic program area. Christian Aid is committed to foster coordination on the issues of loss and damage, specifically utilizing the evidence to inform programming, as well as our advocacy journey on loss and damage. Christian Aid is committed to complement the government of Malawi and other actors in the issues of loss and damage space, and not to duplicate the efforts that are there. This forum has challenged us to partake scientific data and other sources of information to prioritize in our support to loss and damage. This is one of the take-home issue that we need to capitalize on. Thank you all for your great input in sharing the learnings. And I know that we are leaving this space not the same as we came, because there were very insightful discussions that happened over these 3 days. It is my hope and my prayer that the deliberations and actions from this symposium will be part of the game changer in the loss and damage here in Malawi and in the entire Africa. As the old adage says, if you want to go fast, you go alone. But if you want to go far, you have to go with everyone else. And I hope as we discuss these issues of loss and damage, we will leave no one behind. I would like to thank you all for your attention. God bless you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Teo, for those remarks. Now hearing you introduce yourself, I was like, I probably murdered his name. I think, did I say Luke Tembo? Oh, my apologies. There is a Luke Tembo that I know. I think that is why. So my sincere apologies, Mr. Teo, for murdering your name, but thanks again for introducing yourself so that people know the real name. Indeed, we are not to duplicate efforts. So I'm sure that for the 3 days that we've been here, we've been able to network, know who to contact on a particular issue, and therefore moving forward, we will utilize this particular network to be able to join our efforts together and make more impact. Thank you again. Ladies and gentlemen, I now invite Dr. Augustine Njamshi, again on the first day I murdered his name. Dr. Njamshi is the chairperson, Technical and Political Affairs, Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. Thank you, your time.
Thank you. My name is always very difficult for people. So you did not mark Zaka 8. You just helped it to stay alive. Thank you very much. Madam Tawonga Mbale Luka, Director of Environment Affairs Department. My elder brother and senior Evans, I'm glad to see you seated here again. We missed you for a while and happy you could be with us again. Madam Sophie Kanongera, the board chairperson of Sisoneg. Mr. Comrade Julius Ngoma, my junior brother and comrade. Kano Kelly, Programs Manager for Trachea, Malawi. Representatives of the UN agencies present here. Representatives of the academia and research institutions present here. Representatives of media houses present here. Teresa Ndanga, Chairperson of MISA Malawi. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, dear comrades, good morning. We are rounding up this first phase of our engagement this year on this emotive topic called loss and damage. Colleagues, when I was coming here and we left the airport to the hotel, from what I saw on the streets, I saw these women dressed the same way women back home in Cameroon, where I come from, dress. I saw people roasting maize along the road. I saw ordinary people who are just moving, caring about their lives, not asking for any help from anybody. But when I entered this hall, from testimonies and videos from people, it was a contrast of what I saw in the streets. These people don't wake up every day thinking that someone from somewhere will help them to live their lives. Normally, they go about their lives happily, caring for each other without expecting any help from the international community. But because of climate change, they now have to start negotiating, explaining themselves to have the assistance that is needed when their lives have been perturbed. I looked at the senior chief, His Royal Highness, sitting here, and I'm thinking, being a prince, I know what it feels when a chief or a ruler cannot help his people. When he sees his people in agony and cannot help, it feels terrible. And yet, when we're asking for assistance, somebody wants us to bring figures, facts, scientifically proven, in order to show that we have actually been affected. This is unfair. This is inhuman. Let's not forget, when we're talking of compensation for loss and damage, it is not that we are begging. We could live our lives if our environment was left alone. Our riches are not in the banks. Our riches are the empathy we have for each other. We care about each other. Why is it so difficult for the international community to understand that we are suffering from a problem we never caused? Why should the honors of proving lie on us again to say that we have to convince the people who caused the problem to pay for what they have done in our lives, and money can never pay for it? Will you call the lady from Malawi or from Mozambique to come and justify and remember the pains of losing her children and her husband, to come and justify how many children did you lose, Mama, before she's compensated? What are we talking about, really? We have to be enraged enough and say enough is enough. Because liability has been taken out of this discussion. But that does not mean that they are free. You better behave. Put money into the funds. Make it quick and snappy and accessible. Otherwise, liability will come back, and will come back in many forms. I'm not telling people to be rebellious. I'm not just an angry black man talking. Okay? Like some will say, it is unfortunate. Let's take this thing seriously. It's not about numbers. It's about people, real people. We are sitting with them here. How can we take this message to the international community? It is only when we are together, speaking in one voice, that we can do this. As somebody said, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go with others. And I think we'll be going with others. I'd like to take this opportunity and to thank the like-minded friends in the developed countries, especially Scottish Catholic International Aid Fund, Catholic Relief Services, Concern Worldwide, Christian Aid, and others who think that there is injustice, they have to stand with us to move together. On behalf of the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, we'll continue to take the voices, not of the voiceless, the voices of everyone to the table. We'll continue to make the noise. Tag us as being aggressive. Tag us as being angry black people. Tag us as being incomprehensive. We'll make the noise until you listen to us. I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Doc. We all need this holy anger to be able to get to that table and ensure that we are ahead, not leaving that table until we get what we are looking for. So we need to work together in unison to demand what we rightly deserve. I can't agree more, and therefore I will not repeat what the doc has said. Thank you so much again. We now move on with the program. The closing remarks or official closing remarks will be offered by Madam Sophie Kaunongera, who is the board chairperson of the Civil Society Network on Climate Change. But before that, let me invite government through Mr. Evans Njewa, Chief Environmental Officer in the Ministry of Natural Resources and Climate Change, to also offer his remarks. You may offer. Yeah, you may sit. Thanks.
Just to prove that all is not lost. No, I wanted to try. Yeah. I cannot. Yeah, no, yeah, it's fine. Thank you very much, Director of Ceremonies, and good morning, all delegates. Bonjour, bonjour. Yeah, and I've been sent here this morning to just sit in for government. I know there are some colleagues here from government, but you'll recall that the Honorable Minister was here with us on Monday. He did open this regional symposium. He would have loved to be here this morning to close this function, but Parliament is in session, so he's attending to the National Assembly. And the Principal Secretary should have been here in his stead, but he has also been called to an emergency as well. And in hierarchy, the Director of Environmental Affairs, Madam Tawanga Mbale, Luka, she's also not present. She's in Blantyre, also attending to another emergency. So I was sent to sit in for those senior colleagues. The Minister of Natural Resources and Climate Change is the Malawi's focal point to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement. And we are aware that loss and damage is addressed through those treaties. And we're therefore very happy to associate ourselves with the this network, the civil society network, to address loss and damage, the impacts of climate change, so that we can save the vulnerable communities, like we heard from the voices from Madagascar, Mozambique, and on Monday, I think from Malawi and Kenya, I think on Monday. So we stand ready to provide the support to the civil society and other non-state actors in implementing climate action. So the board chair will do the closing. Government, as I mentioned, has allowed that the board chair can close this function on behalf of the ministry. But I wanted to just share with you something that I just received this morning. I read it with passion. So it says, and I'll just quote what's here. So there is a report that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has just released now. It's work that has been ongoing for the past 5 years, and they have just launched this report, the IPCC. And the heading says what the latest IPCC report means for Africa. And we are gathered here as Africans. So the report says that there is a rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. Climate action is reducing emissions, but it's not happening at the scale or pace needed. As a result, there is very little chance of preventing the world from warming beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius, a threshold above which more severe climate impacts will compound Africa's challenges to meet development goals. Now, without urgent carbon cutting and adaptation action, Africa will suffer worsening climate impacts, which will result in increasing loss of life and livelihoods. I think this is what should be at our hearts as we leave this meeting. So Africa will suffer worsening climate impacts, even more than what we have experienced now over the past few weeks through the cyclone Freddy. And there'll be damage to infrastructure and the displacement of people within countries and beyond borders. Dr. Augustine, take note of that. So more frequent heat waves, droughts, excessive flooding, and tropical storms, as well as sea level rise for those that come from countries like Mozambique, with that have the seas and oceans and their borders like that. So this is also to attract their attention. So as well as sea level rise are already hindering the continent's efforts to meet development objectives. So I thought this, I just picked these statements and that maybe we should have them with us as we leave this meeting, and for the international community as well. I know they are aware of what's happening. The impacts will be worsening for Africans, and then we must take action. And again, we want to thank as government, all the partners that have supported this function, and they continue to support also the vulnerable communities in Malawi, and also specifically the Scottish government through the Scottish Catholic International Aid Fund for the support that they have released to Malawi from the Climate Justice Fund last year, and we are sure they will continue, they will upscale their support as well from the studies that they have initiated in Zomba and Chikwawa. So I will conclude by saying that the Transitional Committee of the Loss and Damage Fund, I think you have heard about this over the past 2 days. They just finished their meeting last week in Luxor in Egypt. They met from the 27th to the 29th of March, and they've started work on what and how the Loss and Damage Fund should be molded to operate, and also the funding arrangements for supporting loss and damage associated with the adverse effects of climate change in developing countries. Now, they concluded their work last week by agreeing on the working arrangements, how they will work over the next few months until Dubai at the COP28, and maybe until next year. And also they have come up with a work plan on how they'll conduct their work. I've noted that I think there'll be another session which will be open sort of to delegates like you. You can maybe register. I think invitations will be sent out. Maybe you can be there as an observer. I think there'll be such a conference or workshop in Bonn, I think, end of this month, April. So it's urgent, but invitations I think will be sent. Maybe Julius will get it. You can take that action. So I'll leave it there, and then thank you all for coming. I am a climate change negotiator myself, and I've seen colleagues here read from Ethiopia and a few others. I think you all, from the messages that you have agreed on, I think you will be ready to take this also to the negotiations as when we meet. I think starting from this June, when the subsidiary bodies meet, and then at the 28th Conference of the Parties in Dubai in November, we will make sure, I know Yared sits in the loss and damage discussions and others. Yeah, he's there, I've seen you. And a few other colleagues also from the government here and Julius. So we'll, I think, take some of these things to the next steps. So again, thank you very much. And I leave it here and wish you all safe travels back home. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Njewa, for that assurance that what has been discussed here doesn't end here, but indeed will find its way to be moved to the next stage. Thank you so much, and for highlighting what the recent report is saying, and that's quite a scary position to be in. I don't know what it will take if not for the current situation that African states are in, where citizens do not have food, are forced to eat ash, where citizens, fathers and mothers see their kids being washed away with running water and can't do anything to save them. I don't know what will move the international community to be able to help us. But I guess it's not just by us sitting down and waiting on them, it's for us to push and continue to push. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. I now have the honor to invite Madam Sophie Kaonongera, the board chairperson, Civil Society Network on Climate Justice, who deliver the official closing statement representing all of us here and of course, the government. Madam.
Madam Taong Gambare Luka, Director of Environmental Affairs Department in absentia. I also want to recognize Evans Njewa, my longtime friend in COP engagement. Mr. Julius Ngoma, a friend to many, as I have noted, National Coordinator for Civil Society Network on Climate Change. I also want to recognize Dr. Ben online, Ben Wilson, Advocacy Manager for CF. Thank you that you could be committed. They're online. Dr. Augustine Jamshi, I hope I pronounced that correctly. Okay, thank you. Chair for Political and Technical Committee, Factor. So Colonel Kerry, I don't know if he is here, but that's manager for Troca. So representatives of the UN agencies who are present here, representatives of the academia and research institution who are present here, and representatives of the media houses in Malawi, Teresa Ndanga, chairperson of MISA, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I hope it's still morning, so good morning. Yeah, I'm honored actually to stand before you today to do two tasks. So I'll speak on behalf of, I'll speak as board chair for Seasonic, but I'll also officially close. So I have two tasks. In case I forget, please remind me. I'm very honored actually. So the symposium discussed critical issues of climate change, which has profound impact on economics, livelihoods and ecosystems worldwide, and Africa is not an exception. After all has been said, I have only two things to talk to you about. I would love if, while you leave, to reflect why you were here. Reflect on the reasons why you were here, why you were part of this symposium. I believe that it was not a mistake. So I would want to encourage you to keep reflecting while you have been part of this discussion. The second thing I would want to talk about is, yes, we've been here 2 days, so what will change? And many times when we are overwhelmed with the issues, we think we don't have a part to play. But I want to encourage you and appease that you have a part to play as an individual, as a household member, as a member in your community, and as a staff member or a member in your institution. So as you go, look at what is going to change. What is it that you will do as an individual? And as a member of that community you belong to, whether it's a religious community, whether it's a football club, what is it that will change? Because you are an expert now in loss and damage. Are you going to sit with that, all that knowledge you have, and sit and wait for the next conference? What is it that is going to change? Whatever will change will actually be informed by what actions each one of us are going to take. So that's my main message. Go and take your actions. Go and do your part. Are you not going to say amen? Yeah. To end, I'll just say thank you all for attending this symposium and sharing your experiences, your knowledge, and best practices that can help us to address, avert, and minimize climate-induced damage, loss and damage in Africa. Let us continue to work together towards finding solutions to this pressing issue. And with that, I end my first part. Thank you very much. Nziko Mogambiri. So in my second task today, and this is something I've never done, I've never represented the ministry to do anything. Yeah, literally to do anything. But here we go, okay? So the minister would have been here, and even the directors, they would have loved to be here, but for the reasons which he has already alluded to, they could not. But in his message, Dr. Michael Usi actually is very thankful for each one of you to have been a very participative team in this symposium. And as government, they're looking forward to seeing the communique, and that they will take their part, they will take the actions which they should. In all sense, they are very grateful that you could be here and be part of this. And because at least they tried that Evans could be here, we actually dragged him to be here because we were feeling inadequate without government. So thank you, Evans, for honoring that, dragging you into the meeting. With all those remarks, I have the honor to declare this symposium closed. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Madam Kaonongera. She's the board chairperson for the Civil Society Network on Climate Change, for officially closing the symposium. Thank you so much to all the speakers, those that have spoken at this closing session, those that have spoken or presented throughout the 3 days that we have been here. In a special way, let me thank Sissonek, Pagja, Troca, Concern Worldwide, Christian Aid, the Scottish Catholic International Aid Fund, CRAs, and the organizing team, Julius, Ben, Philip, Connor. You did some great work. Can we give them a big hand, please? We are finishing early, so I hope that my Malawian colleagues, you will have time to take our international delegates around. I hope that no one is flying out immediately after this meeting, that you will have time to at least go around, maybe even go to Salima, it's not very far, where you can see our lake. It's the 3rd largest freshwater body in the world. So it's quite beautiful. So if you can, please go there and immerse yourself in our beautiful waters. Otherwise, I would like to thank you so much for being such an interactive group. I hope you not only enjoyed the symposium, but you also go back with a lot of information, knowledge, and as we have been challenged by Madam Chairperson, that we should question ourselves, ask ourselves what we are going back to do. So we have a responsibility, and I'm sure that we will take up that responsibility as we go back and not just wait on what will be the next meeting, what will be the next action as a group, but as individuals, we need to take up this responsibility. Tea will still be ready outside, even though it's what, to 12? But yes, we'll still have our tea, and then we already have our coupons. We will then proceed for lunch at a later time. Maybe around 12 or so. My Malawian colleagues, you have to assist me. I thought we could close the meeting with our national anthem, and therefore let me ask you to all stand and sing the Malawi national anthem. Oh, God bless our land of peace. Oh, down every name, hunger, disease, every. Going to give all us as one. Down to be free, grow free. Bless our leader, each and every one. And thank you so much, and that marks the end of our symposium. Thank you. And there is a quick announcement before we leave the room.
One moment, please, a quick announcement to the team that is meeting for the South African Community of Practice Network on adaptation. We are meeting here at exactly 2 p.m. We are meeting at 2 p.m. Kindly look at the concept note that has been shared in the agenda before lunch. Thank you so much.
It's time for shaking.